Okay. Well, welcome to this event where, in celebration of International Day of the Girl, the Child Marriage Learning Partners Consortium will be launching new evidence related to the diversity and complexity of child marriage. I'm Suzanne Petroni, and I have the honor of being your moderator for this event today. And I've also had the honor of working with the Gates Foundation and Iris Group over the past 18 months to help facilitate this consortium. I want to note first that this event is being recorded. We are also offering simultaneous translation into French. So if you could please click on the globe icon on your Zoom screen, you can hear the interpretation into French. We have what we hope will be hundreds of people joining us today, and we need your cooperation in making sure that this is a smoothly run event. So we ask that you please keep your microphone muted and your camera off throughout the entire event. Only our panelists will be invited to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves. We do have some time at the end of the event for our speakers to answer your questions, and we will only do this for questions that come through the chat function. So as we go along through our sessions today, if you have questions, we invite you to write those in the chat, and we will collect them and try to get to as many of them as possible when the time comes. Let me turn now to the agenda. What we're hoping is that you'll come out of the next 90 minutes with a better understanding of how collaboration between child marriage researchers, advocates, and implementers can foster effective approaches to analyzing and presenting child marriage evidence and data. We also hope that you'll get a better understanding of the complex drivers of child marriage and how these diverse drivers may impact outcomes for married girls later in their lives. And finally, we will show you where you can find the products that we'll be discussing today. Our event is divided into several sessions. We'll first get an introduction to the Learning Partners Consortium from Dr. Yvette Efebera, the advisor for gender-based violence and child marriage in the Gender Equality Division of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Next, we'll have a panel where we'll hear from several researchers who have authored articles that will be appearing in a special supplement of the Journal of Adolescent Health that's coming out next month. So we're giving you a sneak preview today of what that will contain. Following that discussion, we'll turn to findings from political economy analyses and show you some new hotspot mappings of child marriage. And then we'll hear some of the other things the learning partners have been doing during the course of our collaboration. I'm excited to say that as part of this last session, we'll be the first audience to hear new findings from UNICEF's global analysis of trends related to child marriage. All of our speakers have promised to stay on time, so we should have 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the session to respond to the questions that, again, we invite you to put in the chat box along the way. So let me turn things now over to Dr. Yvette Efebera from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who will introduce the consortium. Yvette.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and welcome, bienvenue to all of you. Again, my name is Dr. Yvette Efebera, and on behalf of our Gender Equality Division at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I am so excited to welcome the hundreds of you that have registered and are tuning into the session. I want to just start before I share a little bit more about the Learning Partners Consortium by sharing a story with you about this topic and why this matters. You know, some years ago, I was leading a research study in Conakry, Guinea on women's experiences with child and early marriages. And I will never forget one of the women, Madame Fan, we called her for short, who was a former school teacher and a community mobilizer in her 40s at the time, who had married at the age of 16. What stuck with me was not just what she shared about her daily struggle to make ends meet, her lament that she wasn't able to complete her schooling because of her early marriage, or the scars and physical and psychological abuse that she faced in her early marriage, although those stories still haunt me. But what really stuck with me was her gratitude. Her gratitude that I would listen to her story and her plea that I would share her story so that others wouldn't go through the same. I wanted to start here because at the heart of the Child Marriage Learning Partners Consortium and the evidence that you'll hear about today are stories like Madame Fan. In fact, 650 million girls and women alive today married before their 18th birthday. 650 million. And for too many, their experiences are painfully unequal. And despite increased global and local momentum led by many of you on this call, the world is still far from achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, as 12 million girls each year marry before their 18th birthday. So let me briefly share how we thought about this issue at the Gates Foundation, why this consortium was created, and what we hope you will all do to keep moving this agenda forward. In the Gender Equality Division, our goal is to accelerate progress towards a more gender equal world by addressing the barriers that keep women and girls from being fully active in their homes, economies, and societies. And one of the many ways that we do this has been through a learning agenda on child early and forced marriage. We kicked off this work in 2019, engaging with and learning from dozens of stakeholders and partners about how child and early marriage too often not only prevents gender equality, but so many of the goals, women's economic empowerment, family planning, maternal health, nutrition, that we also seek to advance. So in 2020, we initiated some short-term grants to spur progress and fill data, evidence, and advocacy gaps in the child marriage space. We made investments in learning more about who is most at risk, where they are, why and how they're vulnerable, and what that means for more intentional action, highlights of which you will hear today. But as I was building out this portfolio and as I was in conversation with all of these partners here, I couldn't help but wonder if there was a way for us to do more and to shift business as usual. And it's from that the Child Marriage Learning Partners Consortium was born. The Learning Partners Consortium was designed to fill a gap by bringing our partners together to test and foster more strategic, coordinated, and effective action by connecting research and learning to program and policy needs. It's made up of leading research, advocacy, and implementing partners, including Freya, Girls Not Brides, the Population Council Girl Center, Unchained at Last, UCSD Center for Gender Equity and Health, UNICEF, and the IRIS Group, who has been a key partner
Did we just lose Yvette? Uh-oh.
Oh, Suzanne, are you still able to hear me?
There you are.
Okay.
Gotcha.
The joys of technology. But the partners have also included UNICEF and, of course, IRIS Group, who has been a key partner in supporting the coordination of this work, each one bringing a special expertise to the table. And in a field that is all too often marred with independence, each one of these organizations were willing to come together every 2 months to coordinate across their respective activities and to explore opportunities to collaborate more and to build momentum on learning for action. I am so excited that over the next 80 minutes, you'll hear directly from each of these partners, as well as a few of the youth leaders and the editors and leads of not one, but 2 forthcoming special journal supplements about their new research and learning and why it matters. And while we'll have too little time to discuss all of the work from the consortium, we are excited to also launch today a website where you can access more information about the briefs and the reports and the articles that are created by learning partners as they become available. Our thanks to Girls Not Brides for hosting this, and I know we're going to put some information for you in the chat and on social media. So let me just end by saying, on a personal note, that Madame Fan's story sticks with me. It sticks with me because I personally am so acutely aware that as both an American and Nigerian, Madame Fan's story could have been my own. If your circumstances were different, Madame Fan's story could have been your own. And for some of you, Madame Fan's story may be similar to your own. What you'll hear today is not just about data and evidence, research and learning, but it is about collaboration and how these can be used to spur action to improve the lives of millions of adolescent girls around the world. So let's continue the conversation here and at #DayOfTheGirl. And thank you all again, and to all of our partners and participants for being here. Suzanne, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Yvette, for those inspiring words and stories, and for this vision that you have supported of a collaborative whose whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Yvette just mentioned briefly the supplement of the Journal of Adolescent Health we are contributing to as a consortium, and we're thrilled to give you an advanced preview of the cover for it, which just came out last night, fresh off the internet presses. The issue itself will come out in mid-November, but as we get ready for our next session, we thought we would show this to you. We will send a link to the supplement to everyone who registered for this event when it comes out, and you'll also see it on the webpage that you just saw, which we'll come back to, and we'll have a link to in the chat for that website. I will also note there is a complimentary supplement of Journal of Adolescent Health that is coming out. We'll hear about that as well in a little bit. So the supplement that we are doing as a consortium coming out next month will contain 5 commentaries and 8 original research articles. And we're happy to be able to hear from 5 of the authors of those research papers today. So specifically in this first panel, we are joined by Anita Raj and Shweta Tomar of the UC San Diego Center on Gender Equity and Health, Claudia Kappa of UNICEF, AJ Melnikas and Sajida Amin of the Population Council. And before we launch into this first session, in this discussion, I just want to remind you to please write your questions that you may have into the chat box, and we'll come back to these toward the end of the event. Again, please don't raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask a question, just write your question in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to turn to the speakers. And the first question I'd like to ask you is to just provide a brief overview of your paper and its key findings. And in the case of AJ Melnikas, we're going to come to her with a little more time because she's actually representing 5 papers. So let's start with Claudia Kappa. Just a brief overview of your paper, please.
Thank you, Susanna, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. The study that was included in this series projects the potential impact of COVID-19 on child marriage in 5 countries in which the burden of child marriage is the largest: Bangladesh, Brazil, Ethiopia, India, and Nigeria. The projected impact of the pandemic on child marriage is based on 5 pathways that are known to have an influence on a girl's risk of getting married: the death of a parent, interruption of education, pregnancy risk, household income shocks, and reduced access to programs and services. We produce models for an unmitigated scenario and unmitigated scenarios in which effective interventions are broadly applied to reduce the impact of the pandemic. And here are the main results of this analysis. The total number of child marriage due to the COVID-19 pandemic in these 5 countries is projected to range from 3.5 million to 4.9 million in the unmitigated scenario, and from 1.8 million to 2.7 million in the mitigated scenario. And the risk and the impact of the pandemic are expected to last until 2035. If similar patterns hold throughout the world, we might expect the number of additional child marriages due to the COVID-19 pandemic to reach up to 10 million girls globally. Obviously, these estimates are subject to uncertainty due to the limited evidence that we have on the true impact of the pandemic on the life of girls. And of course, it will take many, many years before we can fully understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on child marriage. Despite this limitation, however, the potential for harm is unquestionably large, and this is what the article is trying to convey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That's I know people have seen an introduction to the findings, and I think this article will be very informative in terms of the methodology and how you came to those numbers. Let's turn to Anita Raj next.
Sorry, thank you for inviting me. I'm gonna share a little bit of data we have from a study with adolescent married girls in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. This was collected in 2015 and 16. We were really interested in gender role beliefs and the associations between these beliefs and agency for married girls. A lot of what we know about child marriage and gender roles and norms is that increases risk for early marriage and child marriage, but less has been looked at for the longer term effects of these types of beliefs on women and girls' agency once married. So with regard to the beliefs we were focused on, we were looking at acceptability of female marital choice, female economic decision-making, men's role and childcare responsibilities, and the acceptability of marital violence by men against women or by husbands against wives. And with regard to the agency, we looked at social connection, digital connection, freedom of movement, and safety from marital violence. Importantly, what we found was that the beliefs that girls who held beliefs that were more supportive of female marital choice and more supportive of male childcare responsibilities had the most robust findings with regard to social and digital connection, freedom of movement, and marital violence. With regard to beliefs around acceptability of marital violence, that was only associated with marital violence. This is important because this is often what large-scale surveys emphasize as their gender role, and we think that this is indicative of the need for a broader perspective on what gender roles are included in surveys to understand these issues. Importantly, traditional caste and religion norms, which talk about segregation, were also related to these agency outcomes. And so what this tells us is that beliefs about gender roles in marriage matter. They are less traditional beliefs around traditional roles are supportive, appear to be supportive of greater agency in marriage for girls, but non-traditional gender traditional non-gender beliefs matter as well. So it is both about the tradition and about the gender as we try to approach these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Anita. A lot to unpack in that article, and I'm looking forward to that getting more widespread attention. Shweta, let's hear about your paper.
Thank you, Susan. So our paper tested the association of age at marriage with marital decision-making agency. And so most of the studies in child marriage are focused on a cutoff age of 18. So we try to understand what is happening before 18 and after 18. But we were interested in understanding more about variation in outcomes of girls who marry during early adolescence versus later adolescence. So Niger has the highest prevalence of child marriage globally, with 76% of women marrying before age of 18, and nearly 40% of these marriages occur even before the age of 15 years. So while previous studies have shown multiple adverse outcomes of child marriage, Niger provides a unique setting to assess these relationships for women who marry during very early adolescence. So we assessed the association between age at marriage and marital decision-making, specifically participation and satisfaction with participation in household decisions. Our study was conducted in Dosso region of Niger, where we sampled about 800 married girls under the age of 18. Of these 800 girls, 60% were married before the age of 15, and less than 20% reported participation in household decisions. Our models showed the participation of adolescent wives in household decisions was positively associated with age at marriage. So what this means is that within this disadvantaged group of girls who marry before age of 18, those who marry at the earliest were least likely to report current decision-making agency. In addition to participation in household decisions, we also measured satisfaction with decision-making control and found that it was not related to age at marriage. Now, interestingly, most participants reported that they were satisfied irrespective of their level of participation. Previous research has also shown similar findings, which say that in a community with strong gender norms supportive of husbands making decisions, wives may not expect to have any say, and this low expectation may explain their satisfaction with a minor or no role. But to understand this better, we might need qualitative research exploring the meaning and role of women's satisfaction with household decision-making process. So those were the key findings from our study.
Great, thank you. I think both Anita and Shweta's articles touch on the importance of understanding the needs of married girls and what may or may not work to improve their quality of life. So again, excited to read those as we move forward. And the last set of papers, AJ has the task of trying to synthesize 5 very rich papers for us in just a few minutes here. So on to you, please.
Yes, thanks, Suzanne. Here we go. Bear with me. I'm going to try to give a brief overview of the 5 papers we have coming out in this issue. To start, the motivation for this work came from a desire to take a step back and review where we are with the evidence base on child marriage at this moment. So while the evidence base has grown substantially in the past decade, there's still a gap in understanding which drivers are most important across which contexts and which interventions work best to address those drivers. Our research aimed to draw on the available data to understand these drivers, the levels at which they operate and influence, and then think about which programs and policies are best suited to address these drivers. I'm going to start with the first paper that covers a new conceptual framework, and that's shown on the screen there, and I'll walk you through it in a minute, but let me just tell you overview. So this paper is by Saki and colleagues. It's called "What are the Drivers of Child Marriage? A Conceptual Framework to Guide Policies and Programs." And in this paper, we present this framework, which was developed using a literature review and a consultative process with key stakeholders. The goal of this framework is to simplify a visual of the main drivers, the relationship between these drivers, and then provide guidance for developing programs and policies best suited to that context. In this framework, each individual circle represents a core underlying driver of child marriage. Social norms and attitudes and poverty and economic factors precede the other drivers as they are part of the larger social context in which decisions are made. The largest circle in the middle represents the important interactions between these drivers, though we know these could go in multiple directions. Interventions and policies may directly address drivers themselves or the relationship between these drivers and child marriage. And then the drivers of child marriage may also influence short, medium, and longer term outcomes for girls and their families. And I'll talk about a paper that looks at that as well. But the framework for this, the framework presented here really anchors the other 4 papers in the issue. So 2 papers examine the drivers of child marriage more in depth. Masunis and colleagues have a paper called "What Influences Girls' Age at Marriage in Burkina Faso and Tanzania?" exploring the contribution of individual, household, and community level factors. They find that in Burkina Faso, the importance of schooling and the existence of alternative pathways for girls beyond marriage appear crucial to reducing child marriage. In Tanzania, early sexual initiation among girls was common and strongly associated with child marriage. And parents' fear of premarital sex and pregnancy also emerged as a significant factor. Another paper, this is one I just mentioned earlier, examines the long tail of child marriages. So what other outcomes beyond marriage are influenced? This paper by Zara and colleagues is called Drivers of Marriage and Health Outcomes Among Adolescents, Evidence from Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. It examines how the drivers of child marriage influence health outcomes of adolescent girls and young women in India, Malawi, and Zambia. They find that pregnancy before marriage is associated with fewer antenatal visits and hospital-based births in Malawi than pregnancy after marriage, but this association was not found in Zambia. They also find that in India, agency in marital partner choice is associated with a change in depressive symptoms after marriage for girls and young women in India. Now, the next two papers are a little bit different. I'm going to talk about one that looks at interventions in particular and how context shapes what works. Makino and colleagues have a paper called Heterogeneous Impacts of Interventions Aiming to Delay Girls' Marriage and Pregnancy Across Girls' Background and Social Contexts. And that examines the effectiveness of girl-centered asset-building interventions in Bangladesh and Zambia. They find the effectiveness of the same intervention differs depending on the context. The key factors influencing the success of interventions are the prevalence of premarital sex in that context and the availability of work opportunities for girls and young women. Finally, Soler and colleagues investigate whether child marriage changes young people's ability to translate education into paid employment. This article is called Education, Child Marriage, and Work Outcomes Among Young People in Rural Malawi. And they find that child marriage is not a strong moderator of the relationship between education and work, particularly among young married women. They also find that delaying marriage to age 18 does not necessarily confer better outcomes, as young people who marry as adults still face low education outcomes and options. Together, these 5 papers emphasize the importance of context in understanding why child marriage persists and why some interventions that are successful in one setting are not easily transferable to another.
Thank you, AJ. So I think you did a great job of trying to synthesize 5 very diverse papers. And your closing point, I think, is what we really want to leave everyone here with today, which is context matters. This conceptual framework is that it's just a framework, and these different drivers are very different in diverse contexts within countries and subregions, and are really critical to understand as we move forward with trying to come up with interventions and to both prevent marriage and child marriage and meet the needs of married girls. So let me quickly come back around with a second question, which is to ask the speakers what the implications of your work are for the field, and then where do you see a need for further research? So let's start with you, Claudia. On to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. As a data person, the first thing that I would like to underscore is the importance of having robust, large-scale data on the prevalence of child marriage. When we try to project the impact of a crisis, the first instinct will be, let's collect new data. Let's try to understand whether we can go to the field and collect data. Well, in the case of a pandemic, in the case of a crisis, this is particularly challenging. It can affect the quality of the results, and there are a number of different concerns related to the safety and security of those who participate in the data collection. So the first thing that I would like to underscore is the fact that this article had to build on existing evidence. So looking ahead of the possibility of future crises, we need to remember today how important it is to build strong statistical system and to have strong data at the onset and before a possible crisis. Obviously, as with all type of statistical modelings, there is the possibility of errors in estimating. So it is important that this type of projections are done and constantly updated as new evidence become available. And one of the lessons learned from the previous crisis, like for instance, Ebola, is the fact that not a lot was done. Of course, some research was done, but more could have been done to understand the impact of that crisis immediately after the peak of the crisis. So similarly, we should try to invest now resources and skills into understanding the current impact of the pandemic and the future impact as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Really good points. Anita, how about you?
Yeah, so I think our findings elucidate a couple of things that I think need to be pushed on a bit more in the field. So number one, I think a lot of our measures are not where they should be with regard to how we understand gender roles and gender norms. To me, one of the most striking findings was the issue of marital choice. We talk a lot about child marriage, but we don't talk as much or measure as often the choice of the girl in marriage. Is she engaged in the choice? Is it her final? Is she the final decision maker? I think another issue at hand is the growing recognition that what is happening and what's transpiring in the process of this very early marriage, which often is related to a lower level of agency or choice in marriage at the time of the marriage, is that it's compromising agency longer term with regard to the social connection, with regard to the digital connection. And so if this is, and we know that there are long-term effects on healthcare acquisition. So these may all be really tied together about, freedom of movement, that we need to be doing more to think about how do we support girls once they are married. I think even if we increase the rates or reduce the rates of child marriage and we increase the age at marriage, we're still going to see that those who are compromised in their early marriage with regard to their agency we're going to continue to see poorer connection and autonomy. So I think we want to be focusing a little bit more on that. So broader than child marriage, bigger, forced marriage, choice, and agency, broadly speaking, I think are key areas.
All big areas and all important. Thank you, Anita. Shweta, how about you? The implications of your work.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Susan. So as I said earlier, our study showed that women who marry during very early adolescence have even lower decision-making agency compared to those who marry later. So now this findings basically not only just supports the need to delay age of marriage, but more importantly, it suggests that girls who marry during very early adolescence may have very different experiences, challenges, and outcomes compared to those who marry later. And these findings, along with the fact that this lack of agency is broadly accepted, is very different to the context of Niger, where not only child marriage, but also very early child marriage is prevalent. And this should be considered while designing further research and programs, especially in contexts like Niger. Also, such high prevalence of child marriage and low levels of female agency indicates very highly inequitable gender norms, which will need to be addressed as part of any successful effort to improve girls' health and well-being. So that, I guess, are the major implications of our study. And yeah, one of the biggest point it focuses on is the context that Susan, that you and AJ were just talking about. So Niger provides a very different context, and different interventions might not work here. We might need to focus on difference between very early and late adolescent marriages.
Thank you, Shweta. And finally, we'll ask Sajida Amin to talk about the papers that AJ presented on earlier and what you think the implications are for the field.
Thank you, Suzanne. My comments are going to be more general because they do cover a lot of ground. The first thing I want to note is that there has been very important investments and a lot of hoopla since the Girls' Summit in 1914 about child marriage, and clear overdue recognition that this is a problem in many parts of the world and underlying many of the basic realities of women's lives in those contexts. We see from Claudia's work as well as our own work that we're doing that COVID has in situations increased child marriage, but again, what we and we can expect this to happen with other crises and other shocks like COVID, that gains made through programming, through advocacy, can be lost when there is a crisis, when there is a shock. The volume, the aspect of the volume that marks an important change or threshold in the research or in what we know is in this emphasis on diversity and complexity of child marriage. As we've said repeatedly, many of these connections, the importance of the drivers, the impact, the impact of programs are all very context dependent. That's kind of the bottom line. And in order to understand that context, we need to, first of all, recognize that one size may not fit all, but also then to go on to understand why we need to tweak our approaches. So the next point that therefore we need to emphasize is that while we're saying diversity and complexity is important, we also need to emphasize that we're not saying that it's idiosyncratic, that there are things to understand about every context that can be informed by better information, better data, and better understanding of those contexts. Specifically, I think this has come up a couple of times, but what our 5 papers highlight are 2 things. One is the aspect of context that I think needs to be understood is the fact that marriage regimes have an important influence. A lot of what we know about what works are from marriage regimes where arranged marriages, forced marriages, etc., are common, be it because of social custom, be it because of religious rules. And that contextual factor is important. The other that I think is a product of the research that's been going on in very recently, particularly in high child marriage contexts in sub-Saharan Africa, is the importance of premarital sex as a driver of child marriage. When a girl marries because she already is pregnant or has a child, whether it's a forced or not, it's a very different context from when it's an arranged marriage, arranged by families, etc. So the next point that I think, again, a lot of people have emphasized and our papers show is this idea of child marriage has a long tail. Being married early can have very long-term life cycle dependent consequences. Or another way of more negatively putting it is that, or emphasizing the negative impact, is the tall shadow of child marriage. It continues in your life and it follows you everywhere you go. So some of these long shadows are within context, contrasting girls who are married young versus old, but it can also be an aspect of the context of the normative structure. So you wouldn't necessarily see these contrasts between girls within the same communities, but contrasting across communities, which is a lot of what some of these papers have tried to do by emphasizing the normative context within communities. To me, the one factor, one very life cycle dependent factor that is perhaps not emphasized enough is that a very important correlate of child marriage, which is large age differences between spouses, leads to almost guaranteed widowhood in places where girls get married early, when a girl gets married early. And that is something that has been commented on in old literature on marriage, but somehow that's not the kind of perspective that we see now in the child marriage work. And then, of course, Anita's work and that of Fatima and others talks about sort of midlife cycle events, spousal inequality related to child marriage that continues. So then finally, just to quickly talk about what implications this has for programming moving forward. What does this enhanced body of knowledge tell us we should or shouldn't be doing? Here I'm going to be a little bit provocative, perhaps even controversial in saying that in the initial stages of the conversation around child marriage, there was an inordinate amount of emphasis on enforcement of laws or implementation of laws. And what we have seen when we try to study what these changes in enforcement and implementation has done is that their effects are somewhat limited, logistically challenging, and therefore we need to think differently about how laws work and how they might actually work towards the purpose of improving lives rather than limiting them. The aspects of law that I think is very effective and useful is that talking about these enforcement issues, we've had to grapple with issues of consent, and we've had to grapple with these issues that are fundamental to giving girls more right. And then finally, what's the bottom line of all this? I think we've seen all the variation in what is an important driver, what is not, how important voice, choice, and agency is, how important is education, or how might labor force participation work. But what we need to recognize, and I think this is where we need more work, is to see what is the basic driver. So my own work tells me, and this may again vary by context, is child marriage decisions is really a response to the lack of alternatives, to any positive options. And therefore, whatever we choose to do in terms of programming should really ask the question, am I expanding opportunities or am I further restricting choices? And I think there we have our work cut out in terms of all this diversity and where we land on what approach we take. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a terrific summary. All of you did a fantastic job of synthesizing very rich, detailed papers in just a brief but highly informative discussion. So thank you all. I will note now that this journal supplement could not have been produced without the hard, dedicated, skilled, thoughtful, exceedingly detail-oriented work of 3 guest editors who read every manuscript line by line several times to be sure that we were producing a state-of-the-art, clear, compelling issue that fills gaps in the evidence base. So we had a guest editorial team led by Dr. Venkatraman Chandramouli of the World Health Organization, who is a passionate leader in child marriage research. And he led this team alongside Dr. Eunice Mutengi and Mr. Ronald Olam. Eunice is now with the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and Ronald is a student at Makerere University in Kampala. And we're going to take just a couple of minutes to hear from them about their experiences on this editorial team and their sense of the contribution this journal supplement may have to the field. So Ronald, we'll turn it to you first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Suzanne, for inviting me. I am Ronald Olum, final year medical student from Makerere University in Uganda. Early this year, I was selected following a rigorous interview process to serve as co-editors for this supplement. As a young person from sub-Saharan Africa, where there still exists unacceptable burden of child marriage, I was privileged to contribute to this supplement together with Dr. Chandra from the World Health Organization, who is a globally recognized expert in adolescent health, and Dr. Eunice Mutengi from Kenya, currently working with SIF, and has also been actively involved in the fight against child marriage. Through daily Zoom calls, we carefully read each and every line of all the papers submitted to the supplement, more than twice, as Susan stated, and provided the authors with critical and yet very constructive feedback, in addition to comments from at least 2 external peer reviewers. Also, finally, we wrote a commentary synthesizing the contributions of the papers, as well as our thoughts on the fight against child marriage. In addition to all the great and informative set of papers that we've just heard from the authors, I was particularly impressed by a comment from 3 young people who described their experiences in the fight against child marriage. I continue to reiterate their voices that young people are important stakeholders in child marriage interventions, and that they should continuously be engaged. Great thanks to all the partners who have contributed this work, and to all of you who have attended this call. Let's all work together to end child marriage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ronald. Very much appreciate your engagement in this. Eunice, on to you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Ronald. I was really privileged to work with Ronald and with Dr. Chandramouli on this supplement as guest editors and also as co-authors of a commentary. I'm going to speak a little bit to some of the key takeaways from this process and also that were summarized in this commentary. 11 years ago, I was actually a doctoral student writing my PhD dissertation on child marriage. And I remember then grappling with sort of the complexity of child marriage and reflecting on how little evidence there was at that time on what works to prevent child marriage, specifically in Africa. And now, less than 10 years to the SDG target date, we have much more knowledge and understanding about child marriage than we did 10 years ago. So we have stronger global commitment and investment. We also have stronger country policies and programs. And yet, despite this growing attention to child marriage, there are inequalities that continue to persist. There are certain groups of adolescents that are being left behind, particularly girls living in the most marginalized communities. So we need to find a balance between, on the one hand, stepping up our global implementation efforts to achieve those SDG targets, while on the other hand, identifying and addressing the different drivers of child marriage in settings that require a local response. This supplement, as you've heard today, really adds to the evidence base by providing a more nuanced understanding of why we need to consider contextual factors in the design of child marriage policies and programs. The papers really highlight the fact that child marriage is influenced by factors at the individual level, family level, household, community, and the wider society. And they really point to the fact that we're going to need packages of interventions that work across levels and across sectors to address these intersecting drivers. So I think these papers are very timely, especially because we're really under pressure to step up our response in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is increasing poverty and also levels of child marriage in some places. And in order to do this, we really need to know our child marriage hotspots, drivers, and context, and tailor our response. And this is why we feel this supplement is really helpful and timely. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Eunice. And I think you went a long way in just a couple of minutes to answering one of the questions that I saw in the chat, which is the so what? What next? What do we do with this body of evidence to inform the field? Something we'll come back to. So thank you for that, and continue, please, for our participants to put your questions in the chat, and we'll come back to those later. I mentioned at the beginning of this session that there are 5 commentaries in the journal supplement. One of those is written by 3 young researchers based in Guatemala, Lithuania, and Jordan, and we are going to hear from one of those now as we close out this session. So stay tuned for a video.
Hello everyone, this is Sarah Lehouidi. I engage a qualitative researcher here in Jordan. I started working as a researcher when I was an adolescent myself. So I was so passionate to understand much more about what adolescents face in my community. So I started working on child marriage, which is considered one of the most common and hurtful practices here. I started focusing mostly on participatory research and also on working with adolescents for a longer period of time, which allows us to go much deeper than just the statics, and it helps us to understand complex gender norms. Following same girls over time allows us to better recommend policies and programs that could support girls' evolving needs over time. I really hope for the future that we intensify our efforts towards ending such practices and also towards supporting girls enough so they can fight such practices and say no with no fear. Thank you.
Great. We were pleased to have that video to be able to include. We're going to move to our next session now, where we'll hear from 2 different people, or 3 different people. 2 very different approaches to understanding child marriage in diverse contexts. First, Mary Beth Hastings of Iris Group will tell us about a set of analyses that she led, which were aimed to better understand the political economy of child marriage in several countries. And then Ben Leo and Marissa Block of Frame will demonstrate the tools that they use to map child marriage hotspots and associated factors in many of the same countries. So Mary Beth, over to you.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. It's wonderful to be with you all today. I'm just going to present a very high-level snapshot, first covering why we used a political economy analysis and what the analysis showed us about child marriage across 8 countries. As with the other materials that have been discussed, these reports are available online starting today. Next slide. Great. First, a bit about what a PEA, or political economy analysis, is and why it's useful. PEA is a methodology used to examine the political and economic context around a difficult problem like child marriage. The more we know about context, the better we can be prepared to successfully address the problem. We conducted PEAs in 8 countries, 6 in Africa and 2 in Asia. And these PEAs allowed us to assess possibilities for and obstacles to ending child marriage in each country based on the political and economic context. We were careful to ensure this research was gender intentional, paying particular attention to how cultural and political dynamics related to gender affect the issue. The findings can be used by groups such as civil society networks or institutions like governments and donors to set strategy because they give important indications about strategic direction. Next slide. Each PEA includes an overview of the country context and an analysis of evidence within 4 pillars. The pillars help us understand the answers to different questions, which I'll discuss more as we go along. We used key informant interviews and a desk review to gather evidence and then analyze this evidence to develop recommendations. Next slide. Now I'll touch on our common findings across the 8 countries. Foundational factors enable us to identify and respond to those conditions that do not change or do not change quickly. Foundational factors answer the question, what are those factors that are baked in and we need to plan around them? We found that geographic differences, as discussed earlier in the earlier panel, have a strong bearing on whether a girl gets married before adulthood, especially due to ethnicity, climate, and whether she's in the city or in a rural area. Child marriage prevalence is highest among poorest families. However, the extent of influence, as discussed, of economic class or on prevalence varies among and within countries. But across the countries, gender inequality is at the root of child marriage. Next slide. The rules of the game pillar answers questions around the legal framework for child marriage and how it's enforced. And it identifies social norms that may be a stronger influence on behavior than laws. You can see here that there are differing laws across the 8 countries, although all of these countries are committed through international agreements to end child marriage. All of the countries struggle with enforcement, and many have loopholes baked into their child marriage laws. Social norms tend to influence behavior very strongly, and the fear and stigma around girls' sexuality is a prominent concern leading to marriage. Next slide. The here and now pillar lets us answer questions about current events and stakeholders and the effect they have on child marriage. As just an example, here's our assessment of political will to address and end child marriage in each country, based on the signs of commitment by stakeholders and as shown through national processes. We assessed presidential leadership, ministerial commitment, whether there was a costed and adopted national action plan or strategy, whether there was a working civil society network on the issue, and whether government and civil society work together well on child marriage. The asterisk you see there for Kenya is because since our report was completed, President Kenyatta made a commitment on child marriage as part of the Generation Equality Forum, pointing to just how important these international convenings can be for an issue like child marriage. Next slide. Dynamics allow us to look at all the other pillars and assess progress and obstacles in terms of child marriage advocacy, programming, and research. For example, sub-regional data collection, which we will hear more about in the following presentation, has been very important for identifying hotspots and helping adapt programs to the context. Programs are increasingly looking at shifting social norms, which may help drive longer-term reductions in child marriage prevalence. And national action plans are more common, especially in places where the global program to end child marriage has been active in supporting civil society and government in making these commitments. On the other hand, the gender norms that underlie child marriage are very persistent, even through economic and political changes. We need more program evaluations to understand what works and in what contexts. Civil society organizations often struggle to get resources to address child marriage and to confront the forces that want to continue the status quo. We also, as was just discussed, we also need to figure out how to ensure that we don't leave girls without a survival mechanism in the absence of child marriage. Next slide. Country-specific recommendations are in each report, but I just wanted to mention some of the common themes that are across the 8 analyses. Child marriage efforts should be named and resourced as a priority for each country within a larger gender equality agenda, because the two are very closely connected. Women-led and youth-led groups are doing excellent work in this space, but they need greater access to resources and to research findings. Finally, scale up of programs is not necessarily appropriate because context varies so much and is so important for successful programming. Next slide. That's it for my presentation. Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed that small taste of what our analyses found and how they can be used. And just a reminder that you can find these full reports online. And with that, I'll pass it on to our friends at Frame.
Ben and Marissa, on to you, please.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be with all of you and to have been able to collaborate with all of the consortium members so much over the many months. At Frame, our mission is to map humanity, and we utilize advanced machine learning models that combine geo-referenced household surveys and satellite imagery to produce actionable data about what communities look like, how they behave, and even about what they may think about very specific issues down to a 1 square kilometer grid level. As a part of the Learning Consortium project, we focused on 4 key data mapping and analysis activities in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, India, Kenya, Malawi, and Senegal. And for each of these countries, we have really detailed country-specific reports that are rich in data, analysis, and actionable takeaways. And we hope that this brief presentation will pique your interest to spend time in each of these reports, as well as a cross-synthesis report that contains all this information, and like everything else is on the Girls Not Brides website. Next slide, please. For the first activity, we produced hyperlocal visualizations of child marriage prevalence and burden down to that 1 square kilometer resolution that I was talking about. And we examined change over time at this resolution. And strikingly, we found amongst the examined countries really 2 different categories of countries. The first, like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Malawi, experienced widespread improvements at both the national as well as at the localized levels, and pretty consistently across space across the countries, and we notice those changes over time. In other countries like Kenya and Senegal, which you see at the bottom, national prevalence rates barely changed at all during the examined time periods. Yet, when we look at a subnational level or down to a community or subcommunity level, we find that there were very material or very significant changes. Some areas that were improving, oftentimes dramatically, and other areas that witnessed a deterioration of prevalence rates, which all of this, and particularly the latter point, dovetails with one of the core themes that we've been hearing up until now from the other consortium members about how context matters, about how locality really, really, truly matters. Second, we analyzed the relationship between child marriage prevalence and a number of community level indicators, like employment patterns for women, for men at different age groups, education levels and outcomes, access to healthcare as well as health outcomes, and access to a range of different kinds of services like electricity or water and sanitation. And the objective of this analysis and this mapping was to understand in a more nuanced and localized way the community level environments in which we also find higher child marriage prevalence rates. The third body of work for each of these countries and a component that really built off of some of the work that the Population Council did. We benefited tremendously from their work, is we explored and mapped a range of potential risk factors for child marriage down to that same resolution, including things like pregnancy outside of marriage, poverty, as well as gender inequitable attitudes and behaviors. So we were looking across the country and across time where those types of issues may have been more prevalent or pronounced, and then exploring, are those strong correlates with where we see higher prevalence rates, and having that feed into our body of knowledge and understanding of dynamics across and within countries. Fourth is we conduct a series of localized hotspot analysis in each of the 6 countries. And my colleague Marissa is going to provide a visualization from Kenya that briefly demonstrates how these 4 distinct and mutually reinforcing components can inform a range of research policy as well as advocacy activities. Next slide, please, and over to Marissa, please.
Thank you, Ben. Here, we're examining Kenya using 3 DHS surveys spanning just over a decade, 2003 to 2014. This type of localized mapping and analysis can be updated as additional large geotagged household surveys become available. National child marriage prevalence rates remained largely static in Kenya over the examined time period, roughly 26 to 28%. But there were significant changes across space and time, as we'll see in just a moment. At the county level, we see where prevalence was significantly higher. Places like Turkana, Mandera, Wajir, Isiolo, and Garissa in the northern part of the country, represented here in the darker shades of red. At the same time, the more affluent and densely populated areas, ranging from Lake Victoria in the west towards Mombasa on the coast, had far lower prevalence rates, represented in the lighter shades here. Next slide, please. Now we can zoom into Turkana County, which had the highest child marriage prevalence rate in the country. Rates stayed persistently high over the examined time period, hovering around 60%. Using our web-based visualization tool, we can very quickly and easily analyze how prevalence has varied across time in Turkana, examine community context factors such as employment rates, access to infrastructure such as electricity and water and sanitation, education rates, and other community level indicators. And finally, we can assess which of the 4 types of potential child marriage risk may be at play the most. Now, with only a few notable exceptions, like potential risk related to gender inequitable behaviors, Turkana lagged the country overall. Also, again, we can see that in southern Kenya, there was a much lower prevalence rate, and this includes Kajiado, a county with roughly 1 million people. Next slide, please. Now, when we shift from a county level lens on the left to a ward level lens on the right, we see that there are multiple areas with very high child marriage prevalence rates. Next slide, please. Now let's zoom into Magadi ward. Child marriage prevalence was about 55% in a county with half that rate overall. In Magadi, nearly all of the key community context indicators rang alarm bells. The female primary education rate was less than a quarter of the county level average. That's 15% versus 59% in the county. Health facility usage was about 20 percentage points lower than the county average of 70%. And finally, the female employment rate was also half the county average. That's 30% in Magadi compared to 57% at the county level. What this tells us is that high prevalence hotspots like Magadi would be entirely missed if we only considered county level statistics, reporting, or analysis. Now, what I've shown you here is just a glimpse of some of our work. Each of our 6 country reports are rich in data, analysis, and takeaways like this. Additionally, they are also more broadly highlight how new machine learning-based techniques can help to pinpoint where child marriage remains stubbornly high and help to illuminate the environment in which at-risk girls and young women are living. Our hope is that this novel type of approach and the localized contextual information it provides can help all of us move the needle as much as possible and support all of the stakeholders who are championing change. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you all so much. So much we want to say, but we are running out of time. So I'm just going to jump ahead to the next session and say that there are many other products that were developed through the Learning Partners Consortium that we can't all fit into this event. The analyses that you just saw presented are available on the website that Yvette mentioned earlier and that we'll hear about again shortly. So we encourage you to go there. We can't do justice to all of the great work that was done by the consortium, but we're going to ask just a few more partners to briefly describe some of what they've done. So let's start with Ms. Arwen Finney of Girls Not Brides. Over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and to everyone else who's already spoken. It's been really interesting. I'll try and be very, very brief. So for us at Girls Not Brides, our role in the consortium has really been focused on making learning and evidence available to our civil society organization members. So we've been focused on 3 key areas of activities. So firstly, briefs to synthesize learning and evidence in a way that's easy to understand, learning events to increase uptake of evidence and to foster peer-to-peer learning with a focus on our African members and national partnerships, and lastly, improving our website to make it more of a learning hub. So in terms of the learning briefs, we've been working on 6 throughout the grant. We've already managed to publish 3 of these, 1 on FGM and child marriage, 1 on education and child marriage, and 1 on child protection. Each of these looks at how efforts to address child marriage can be integrated into other sectors, where they're clearly linked, and suggests how members can address child marriage by creating strategic partnerships with actors in these different sectors. We're still to publish 3 more, 1 on child marriage and intersectionality, 1 on child marriage and cash transfers, and 1 on supporting married girls and adolescent mothers who are often overlooked by the child marriage movement. These will be published shortly, so watch this space. They'll also be available on the webpage. In terms of the learning events, we did 5 learning events with our African members in different countries and also with our national partnerships. One of these workshops that I'd really like to highlight here was the Africa Action Group to End Child Marriage workshop. which took place online. So the Africa Action Group to End Child Marriage was originally created to enable like-minded partners from across the continent to form a more strategic and cohesive approach to their advocacy work on child marriage. And following a period of inactivity, Girls Not Brides have been working with our members in Africa to reformulate the group. We know, as many of the other speakers I think have already said, that despite the massively increased interest in child marriage over the last decade, there's often been little synergy between evidence generation and the implementation of programs and policy. And there's therefore been limited uptake of child marriage research and findings in child marriage practice. So the renewed African Action Group to End Child Marriage is intended to help bridge that gap. And so as a first step in August, we brought together different child marriage practitioners and researchers from across the continent to take stock of the existing evidence base on child marriage in Africa and to identify key evidence gaps. So really thinking through what are the priorities, what are our key learning needs across the continent if we're to address child marriage more effectively, and also to discuss ways of working to bridge the gap between research and practice going forward. So some of the key learnings and consensus points that I'd like to quickly share were how little research there has been in high prevalence Francophone countries in Africa compared to Anglophone ones. And there was very strong consensus there needs to be more attention to the issue in these countries and more research in each of these countries, because we have a more limited understanding of how child marriage manifests in many of the countries across the Sahel, which have very high prevalence compared to other countries in Africa. Other consensus points emerging, kind of linked to some of the previous presentations, were the need for more subnational data collection and the need for more exploration of how things like livelihood strengthening can be used to address child marriage. The need to learn from failure, and the need to invest in African research institutes who can really help strengthen that evidence base at the local level. So going forward, the group will continue to bring together child marriage researchers and practitioners to foster that evidence uptake, but also to advocate collectively for further research in some of those priority areas that were identified collectively. So lastly, we have also relaunched our website, which now serves as a better function, our function as a learning hub. And it makes it easier for users to find all the learning and resources that we have available there. So we have many resources beyond what is on the consortium page, but I think we have the consortium page you can see here on the screen, and you can also see the link where you can access that. I'll share it again in the chat, and I would really encourage everyone to go ahead and check it out. You can access all the products that have been produced by this consortium that have been published yet. We'll be adding more as some of them are to be launched in the coming weeks. So please go ahead and check out. It's a great resource where you can access all the learning that's come out of this consortium, as well as other resources related to child marriage that might be relevant to your work. So thank you, everyone. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Arwen. We really appreciate it. One question that has come up in the chat is around whether child marriage takes place in developed country settings. And I think it's great that we're going to hear from Freddie Rice about one such country. On to you, Freddie.
Yes, absolutely. So for a long time, no one knew how often child marriage was happening in the United States, but we at Unchained at Last, an NGO that's working to end forced and child marriage in the US through direct services and advocacy, we answered that question with our study, which was the first of its kind. What we found was that nearly 300,000 children were married in the United States between 2000 and 2018. A few of them were as young as 10. Most of them were girls wed to adult men with an average age difference of about 4 years. Further shocking was that at least 60,000 marriages during that time period occurred at an age or with a spousal age difference that should have been considered a sex crime. One positive note was that the national number of children married decreased almost every year between 2000 and 2018. However, we know that the number will not drop to zero without legislative intervention, because here is a key takeaway from our study. All 300,000 children who married in the US in that period were married legally. For that entire period, child marriage was legal in all 50 US states. And as we sit here today, child marriage remains legal in 44 US states. There are many reasons to end child marriage, but in the United States, including as well as the rest of the world, but here are the three main ones. One is it can too easily be forced marriage. And that is because even the most highly mature 16 or 17-year-old in the United States does not have the rights of adulthood. And that means basic rights like leaving home, they can't do typically very easily, to escape from parents who are planning an unwanted wedding for them, or to escape from an abusive spouse. They typically are not allowed to enter a domestic violence shelter. They cannot easily retain an attorney because contracts with children usually are voidable. And then perhaps most shockingly, because they're usually not allowed to bring a legal action in their own name, they're usually not even allowed to file for divorce. Marriage before 18 in the United States creates a nightmarish legal trap. Second really important reason to end child marriage in the US, the US State Department calls marriage before 18 a human rights abuse because of the devastating lifelong repercussions, including here in the United States, an American woman or girl who was married before 18 sees significant negative consequences. Well, significant consequences in terms of her health, her education, her economic opportunities, even her physical safety. And then, as I mentioned before, a third really important reason to end child marriage is it undermines our statutory rape laws. As I mentioned, tens of thousands of children were married recently in the United States before they were even old enough to consent to sex. There is a simple solution. 44 more states can do what 6 states have done so far and pass legislation to make the marriage age 18, no exceptions. There are some human rights abuses that don't have a simple solution, but child marriage in the United States has a simple solution. We can not only end child marriage in the United States in our lifetime, but we can end it within the year if we all join forces and insist that our legislators do the right thing. I urge you to go to unchained.last.org to see more about our study and simple steps you can take to help end child marriage in the US.
Thank you so much, Radhi, for your passion and your work that reminds us that the US is part of the globe of which we speak. I'm going to turn it now to Nankali Maksud, who is the head of the UNICEF UNFPA Global Program to End Child Marriage. Nankali.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. So part of the work that we've been doing within this consortium, I thought was really interesting. While we've made progress globally and also at national level in terms of responding to child marriage. In fact, only just last week, we had the Human Rights Council pass yet another resolution calling for an end to child marriage. A number of countries globally have national plans of action in place. The challenge that we were bringing to the table is what's happening at subnational level. It is important to have laws in place. It is important to have national plans of action in place, but we know where it really matters is at subnational level. And so we were looking to find out what countries are doing at subnational level. We particularly looked at India. We also looked at Ethiopia, and we're hoping that Zambia will also be able to come into the mix. But just to say that actually we looked at even more countries to see what it is that they're doing at subnational level. It was a struggle, and many people who are working within this sector will know what I mean by a struggle, in the sense that we have a number of very nice programs that are taking place at subnational level through various implementing partners, but many of them are not at the scale that is required to respond to the caseload that we have. At the beginning of this meeting, Yvette referred to the caseload that we have. We know a number of girls have been affected by child marriage and will continue to be affected as we go forward. So do we have the programs at subnational level closest to the girls to be able to respond to that caseload? Our findings in many of these countries was that, yes, we have programs, but many of them are small. They don't match the number of the caseload that is in place. Where we do have programs, also, they have challenges in terms of their monitoring systems. So when we're going in and not just, monitoring, but also monitoring and evaluation. So we are implementing small programs that have not been evaluated. So we don't know whether they can be able to go to scale over time. And if we are now, 8 or 9 years to achieving the elimination goal, it's a huge challenge for us to be able to have programs that are at scale, and that are able to be able to respond to this caseload. In addition to challenges around monitoring, is also issues to do with fiscal space. While countries are ready, willing, and able to put into place national plans of action, when it comes to subnational level, creating that fiscal space so that we can be able to invest and fund these programs at the scale that is required is also a challenge for many of the countries that we have. And in a number of countries, when we review now, the national plans of action are even coming to an end. So how have the national plans of action come to an end when they haven't been implemented effectively at subnational level in the hotspots that many of the implementing partners in this consortium have referred to today? The other thing, final thing that I also want to mention is, the nature of the programs that are being implemented. We know at this stage that, we want to be able to have multi-sectoral programs at subnational level. It looks, what the evidence has shown us is that, when the programs are designed and they're dealing with a particular issue, perhaps ensuring that girls get back into school or ensuring that girls can be able to access mental health products, the programs are good, they exist, and they're able to deal with that. But the more that we pile into these programs, for example, if you then want to add on issues in some of our countries, we've seen at subnational level, perhaps you want to be able to address issues to do with food, with employment, and we add on these additional components onto the programs, the harder it is for those programs to be able to go to scale, especially when they are government-driven programs. Sector-focused programs are much easier to be able to go to scale as far as government systems are concerned. And that's a challenge for us because we want to be able to deal with multiple components that are going on within the context of child marriage. The final point that I'd like to raise, of course, is context. We also have seen differences between how these programs are designed in South Asia versus Africa, and also in different parts of Africa as well. So it's something that we should take into consideration. The issue of contextualization remains very important. There are places where some of our governments have got greater fiscal space and some where they have less fiscal space. And that impacts the extent to which we're able to deal with child marriage within this different context. We hope to be able to complete this before the end of the year. The publications will be available also at the site that Arwin was sharing. So please do look out for that in the Girls Not Bride site for us to learn and do better as we go forward. Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Thank you, Nankali. Lastly, I teased earlier about the fact that we're getting a sneak preview today of UNICEF's new Global Child Marriage Trends Report, which will be officially launched tomorrow. And Claudia Capa is back to give us a very quick overview. We're running short on time, so just a quick overview and some highlights. Thank you, Claudia.
Absolutely. So what is the question that we were trying to address with this report? Well, it's a simple question that many have been working on. What drives progress in reducing child marriage? And many of the studies that have been conducted so far specifically look at the individual and community level and trying to understand who are the girls most at risk and what has proved effective in reducing the risk of child marriage. With the publication we're going to be launching tomorrow, we looked at historical trends with a focus on selected countries that have recorded significant declines in child marriage prevalence. The publication offers an overview of changes in the practice of child marriage, together with a review of other shifts that have occurred in this country at the population level in terms of girls' access to education and employment opportunity, as well as economic development and poverty reduction. The publication features global and regional estimates, as well as country profiles. We have featured 9 countries that have made significant progress in reducing child marriage, and we use data spanning a period of nearly 30 years. The findings of the report are intended to raise awareness of the conditions that need to be in place to promote the societal transformations that would lead to a rapid drop in the prevalence of child marriage. So what are these countries? First of all, we look at Bangladesh, India, Ethiopia, and Indonesia. These are countries that have made significant progress in reducing the prevalence of child marriage, but also because of the population of women in these countries is significant, this has translated in significant declines in the number of child brides. But we also look at other countries, the Maldives, Tunisia, Rwanda, Armenia. These are countries where the practice of child marriage was much more common 25 years ago, and now they are near elimination. They are projected, actually, in many of those countries to achieve elimination of the practice of child marriage by 2030. And lastly, we look at Eswatini. Why? Because Eswatini is an interesting case. In most of the countries, the prevalence of child marriage has declined mostly among the richest girls. But Eswatini is a good example of a country where the progress has been equitable, and improvements in reducing the prevalence of child marriage have actually benefited the poorest girls the most. So what is the main findings of the report? Well, is the fact that progress in child marriage has been accompanied by significant shifts over 20 and 30 years in other indicators at the macro level, including access to education, particularly secondary education, access to employment opportunity for women, poverty reduction, and an increase in the GDP. But the publication also shows how all these shifts at the macro level are interconnected. Raising the education levels of girls by itself is not sufficient unless there are more employment opportunity for women. Increasing the level of wealth of a country is important, but not sufficient unless we are able also to shift the most vulnerable population out of poverty and reduce inequality. So all in all is a confirmation of something that has been mentioned earlier. Opportunities for girls are key. We are not going to be able to end child marriage unless we offer girls and their family better opportunities. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow at the launch. For those who want to register, I included the link in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and great preview. Thanks for including the link there. Thank you to the panel. We are running out of time, so I think some of the questions that folks have put in the chat have been answered through the discussion today. I will turn it over very quickly to Meg Green, who is going to give us a brief preview of the second journal supplement that we mentioned is coming out in the Journal of Adolescent Health. So Meg, very quickly over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And congratulations, all of you, for bringing this wonderful effort to all of us. I'll be extremely brief in talking about the second supplement. You know, so much research has been taking place on child marriage that there's a great volume, and we saw a person reference in the chat as well about the research that they're looking to publish. The supplement I'm here to tell you about is supported by the Candida Fund with contributions by Summit Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It reaffirms the findings that we've heard about today, and it has also made a special effort to decolonize child marriage research. And what that means is, first, having sought out diversity across geographies and beyond low and middle income countries. Secondly, highlighting the themes that are the same across widely divergent settings, many of which we've heard about today: girls' sexuality, gender inequality, legal ambiguity, reflecting ambivalence about gender, sexuality, and age. And then finally, the importance of boys and men and masculinity as important pieces of the puzzle. And then finally, although low and middle income countries have been the focus of research, so much of the research has been conducted in the global north. So this supplement tries also to emphasize global south perspectives through the selection of papers and the framing of the evidence, with 4 editors based in 4 different regions, a donor and global south advocate who collaborated on the commentary, and current and former regional coordinators of Girls Not Brides who have also written an editorial. So the supplement is expected in December or January. Please keep your eyes open for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So that will follow on our supplement that will be available in November. So all of this you can find at the website. Going to turn it over to Yvette now to close us out.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks to all of you. What an incredible amount of evidence that's just come out. Look, if I could just close this out, here's what I would say. When I hear the what of the power of all of this work, 3 words: context is crucial. When I hear the how, about how we can better do this work, I'm going to quote Dr. Shelley Van Eaton here, who said, "What each of us can accomplish on our own will fit in the palm of our hand, but that is insignificant to what we can accomplish together. This effort was meant to bring different voices together, and our call to you is to continue to engage. Check out the website, dig into these different learning products as they get posted there, use them, build on them to inform your research, the policies you're setting, the interventions you're designing, because ensuring that girls can decide if, whom, and when they marry, and that adolescent girls and women have the best outcomes will require us all. We're so excited to continue the conversation. Thank you again to all of you for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Please go to the website for more information. We look forward to working with you in the months and years ahead. Thank you.